Hello, I'm Dr. James Galloway. I'm delighted that our paper on the placebo response in rheumatoid arthritis trials has been selected this month by the editor, Dr. Earl Silverman. And I'm going to say a few words on behalf of Dr. Katie Bechman, who was actually the first author on the study, but unfortunately isn't available to do this recording. I will structure this by saying a few words about what we found. I will briefly say why we did the study and what our reasoning behind undertaking the project was in the first place, and also briefly mention our methodology so you can try and understand the risk of bias in the findings and how much you can trust our results. So the headline of what we have described is that if you consider the ACR20 response for clinical trials of patients with rheumatoid arthritis, which is a common outcome measure that has been used in many of the majority of clinical trials over the last 20 years, then the proportion of people who achieve an ACR20 in the placebo arms has been steadily rising. If you look at trials from 20 years ago, for example, you see that typically around 20% of people, often fewer, would achieve an ACR20 in the placebo arm. In the last 5 years, we've not seen any clinical trials where the ACR20 response has been below 30%. In fact, many of them it's been above 40% and some as close as 50% in the placebo arm achieving that treatment response. This obviously has important implications when we are interpreting clinical trials of new drugs in the field. So the reason we wanted to undertake this study was partly our own personal observation that across the congresses in Europe and the US over the last 10 years, we've seen these rising reported rates of placebo response. And in fact, with some of the JAK inhibitors, and when we saw, there's obviously the JAK inhibitors are a class that we've seen data coming out, particularly in the last couple of years from clinical trials. We saw placebo arm responses from subpopulations, from certain geographic distributions, hitting the 50% mark. We wanted to investigate this. And I should say, as another bit of background, there is an awareness in clinical trial settings in other disease areas, for example, in hypertension, that in other disease areas, placebo responses have also been climbing. So why might this be? Well, there's a few things that crossed our mind. The first is, in rheumatoid arthritis, we have a situation where people with rheumatoid arthritis have fluctuating disease activity. They have episodic flares sometimes. As many of our clinical trials require people to have severe disease at the point of study entry, it may be possible that we are increasingly capturing people during states of transient flare when they enter the trial. Those people who are transiently flaring will get better whatever we do. The effect we might term regression to the mean. And it could be that some of the increasing placebo response is because we are recruiting a larger proportion of patients who are in a flare rather than patients who have sustained severely active rheumatoid. Second is the possibility that we're seeing an effect of geography. In high healthcare resource countries, there are now many treatments available to manage rheumatoid arthritis. And a challenge of this is that it's harder to recruit patients to studies when many treatments are already on the table for them. As a result, unsurprisingly, we have seen growing numbers of clinical trials taking place in countries that have less healthcare resource available. And the clinical trials then provide a means of access to treatment. And this is not something I'm saying is a negative phenomenon. I am an advocate for clinical trials and an advocate for getting wider access to treatment for patients. But consider this, in a resource poor setting, when you take part in a clinical trial, you not only get enrolled in a study and given regular follow-up, perhaps more frequent follow-up than you would otherwise receive, but you also have other medications supplied and paid for during the study. For example, methotrexate, your background immunosuppression therapies. And if those hadn't been regularly administered prior to the study entry, actually what we may be doing when we enroll people into clinical trials is looking at interventions which include not only the new drug, but also introduction of standard of care, which may not have been fully available prior to entry into the trial. Thirdly, of course, I think we have to acknowledge there may be changes in expectation in healthcare. We have seen an enormous evolution in healthcare across all fields of medicine, and there may be an expectation bias of patients as to what they expect from treatments, how well they anticipate a drug may work. These we talk about in the discussion, and if anyone wants to write a comment as to other things, I suspect we haven't got a single reason why we're seeing a rising placebo response, but rather it is a complex and combined effect of many facets of clinical trial design and conduct. Irrespective of the cause of it, it's definitely happening, I believe. We, in terms of our methods, and I'll just say very briefly what we did to reach these conclusions. It was a systematic review which we conducted looking for clinical trials of new interventions, new drug interventions for rheumatoid arthritis. Our primary source when we undertook the search was the Cochrane Register of Clinical Trials. We expanded that looking for other trials through links or through congresses that we were aware of. And our analysis approach, we used a meta-regression, and we did that so we could account for differences in patient characteristics in the different trials, such as differences in age or disease severity at trial enrollment. So we could account for those when we looked at the impact of looked at the ACR 20 response. We also present ACR 50 and ACR 70 responses. And for those people who are reviewing the paper, or looking at the paper, I think figure 1 is a really important figure in which we present graphically the placebo response across the papers and across the trials that we report on. Hope you enjoyed the paper, and I'm very grateful for the Journal of Rheumatology for selecting it for the editor's choice. Thank you.